Okay, so hello everybody. I'm back for a short hiatus. Guten Tag. What I'm going to talk about just briefly is actually, you guessed it, wheel bearings. In this instance, I'm actually not talking about the rear wheel bearings or the wheel bearing hub assembly in the case of the SX4. And I'm talking about strictly SX4s here, although I suspect this will apply to many vehicles out there. In the past, I replaced the front wheel bearing assembly, the front wheel bearings on my car, because I thought I had issue with them at the time. It turned out to be not the case, but you live and learn, right? So I should have done this some time ago, months and months ago, in fact, when I actually did this job. But one thing you might encounter when you're actually going through the manual for the SX4 is they're talking about the wheel speed sensor encoder. And then they use wheel speed sensor and they use encoder. And the terminology can actually be a wee bit confusing, or at least it was to me. So that's the whole point of this video, is to clarify the wheel speed sensor and the wheel speed encoder, again with respect to the front wheel bearings. Again, I'm not talking about this assembly. I've talked this to death. Again, that's a rear hub assembly. Strictly the front wheel bearing assembly I'm talking about in this instance. Okay, so this is obviously an exploded diagram of it. You can see that the bearing is in fact press fit into the knuckle, and then of course it's held in by a circlip, and the hub itself is pressed into the bearing. And of course the drive shaft comes through, and then the nut, expendable nut, is shown on the outboard side of the drawing here, just so we can appreciate where this bearing actually lives. So here's the wheel speed, here's the entire strut assembly, of course, with the steering knuckle. It's all assembled, and this drawing is actually highlighting the harness for the wheel speed sensor. There's a single bolt, and you can see that it actually bolts into position on the steering knuckle. And this is just a quick diagram showing you with the wheel rotating. It is in fact a Hall effect sensor and generates a 5 volt, 0 to 5 volt square wave. Perfect square wave, pretty much, because it is a Hall effect sensor. So here's the sensor itself. You can leave the wheel speed sensor in situ. I never did remove it. It's possible you replace the bearing without actually removing the wheel speed sensor. So again, the whole point to this video is the encoder, right? So here's the page from the manual. This is all from the manual, where they're talking about, let me zoom you in. They're talking about front wheel speed sensor encoder on vehicle inspection. And if you read through this, you're thinking to yourself, what the hell are they actually talking about? Is there a tone wheel? It's separate from the wheel speed sensor, or at least that was. Maybe it's clear to somebody else who reads it, but it wasn't for me. That's why I'm doing it. Maybe if somebody else reads through this manual, there'll be a degree of confusion for them as well. Again, the whole point to this video. And I was reading through the manual, and then they show you that for inspection purposes, they show you they've removed the drive shaft and inspecting it, and they're talking about the encoder here. Well, what encoder? What is it? A separate assembly? Am I missing something here? That's just the back side of the bearing, right? You can see the bearing. There's seal on the one side, seal on the other side. It's not symmetrical the way it looks, and I'll get into the details of this in just a minute, but there's maybe more to this that meets the eye. Now, for seasoned mechanics and professional mechanics, this is no news to them. Cars have been designed like this for a dozen years now, right? But if you're just a weekender like myself, this is maybe something that came as a surprise to me. At least it did, I don't know, like I said, 6 months ago, a year ago, whatever it was when I actually done this job. So if you read this caution note here, it says front wheel speed sensor encoder is included in the front wheel hub assembly. Front wheel hub assembly. So to me, a front wheel hub assembly is this, completely assembled. That's a front wheel hub assembly to me, right? This assembly pressed into the knuckle, including the hub, the bearing, all pressed as an assembly. this is where the confusion came in for me, because I'm looking at the diagram here that tells you how to actually go through the repair process for replacing the bearing. I won't get into the details, but it shows you this drawing here, and again I'll zoom you in on it, because again this is the point that actually needs clarified. So this note here says, apply light grease to the face of the bearing when you're actually assembling it. Do not apply grease to the encoder section to avoid encoder malfunction. Again, you're looking at this. Encoder. What are they talking about? Like, it is like a mystery, if you're not familiar with this, right? There is no separate encoder. Again, they refer to it as, if it's damaged, replace the entire wheel hub assembly. Well, it's inside the bearing here, right? And we'll get to this in just a minute. Again, this is no news to any seasoned mechanic, but for a weekender like myself, you know, surprise. So you can see on the drawing here, it doesn't really clarify anything. You're thinking to yourself, well, install the steering knuckle with the wheel hub and bearing so that foreign material does not enter the wheel speed sensing point. Then you're looking at this. Then you're looking at the cross section of the bearing. Then you get the bearing and you're looking at it and you're thinking, am I missing something? And again, down to the cross section of the entire hub assembly here, it shows you item 2 on the drawing, and they even enlarge it so you can see cross section of the bearing, but it still doesn't provide any clarification, or at least it didn't for me. So maybe this will help somebody who maybe misinterpreted. Maybe this is clear as a bell to some people who see these and think, well, you're just a dummy, buddy. You don't know what you're looking at. And maybe even that's true to a degree. But inside this bearing, there's 2 seals on it. And one of the seals actually has effectively the tone ring for the system. It's not a tone ring. They refer to it as an encoder. But as the bearing rotates, as this bearing rotates, can you see that the seal is actually going with it? Here's the seal side. Here's the standard rubber seal side. You can see it's stationary, but on this side, kind of brownish in color as opposed to the black, it's actually a maybe the camera's not picking that up too great, but it's actually rotating with the inner race. So let me see if I can get the camera in tight enough here. And one of my pals actually put me onto this, one of my YouTube pals, Dave Sterl. You've heard me talk about Dave a million and one times. He actually brought up this. Basically, it's a film that's capable of actually sensing magnetic fields. I think it's basically nickel particles that are suspended in an oil of some sort. And anyway, they interface with a magnetic field, and then they can actually make magnetic fields visible. So this will actually help, I think, to some degree. Let me see if I can get the right camera angle on it. So here I've actually got you in a tight shot on the bearing, and as I said, this card is capable of sensing magnetic field or disruption in the magnetic field. So I hope you can see there. Can you see the segmentation? I hope that's visible. Those segments are the magnetic encryption in the encoder. So as that actually rotates, sorry, let's see if I can get it a bit better. As that rotates, that's what the wheel speed sensor is actually sensing. So this bearing has to be put in the correct side. Now, an easy way to tell which is, are you going to have this? Extremely unlikely you will. But you can see this side. Nothing. This side. It's actually magnetic. I've just got a wee screwdriver here, right? And that's how you can tell which side is which. So, extremely important that you're actually aware of this. This can cause, you install this, because it's, other than that, it's pretty much a symmetrical bearing. you install this incorrectly with the wrong side at the wheel speed sensor, it's not going to sense the wheel speed, obviously, because the encoder wheel is only actually integrated into the one seal. So when you open this box, by the way, here's the part number if you're interested in SX4. This is for a 2000, although I think they're probably all the same. SX4 front wheel bearing. It's a Timken bearing. There's the part number. No cheap, like $100 each Canadian, but good quality bearing. When you open these boxes, anytime there's a little pamphlet inside, take the time to read it. Don't just dismiss it, as everybody does, including myself on occasion. There's the notation there. For vehicles equipped with ABS, the bearing can only be installed in one direction. One of the two seals contains a built-in magnetic impulse ring. Again, the terminology is changing, but that is what Suzuki is referring to as the encoder in the manual. The impulse ring must be placed closest to the ABS sensor, so extremely important. And there's a wee notation there telling you you can actually find out which side is which because it's magnetic. Check it with a paper clip or whatever it says, right? So take the time to actually read this stuff. So I hope that actually helps somebody, because it was actually very confusing to me, the terminology in the manual and the cross sections of the bearing didn't seem to actually clarify anything for me. Once you realize that the encoder is actually an integral part of the bearing, the seal proper, then things seem obvious and straightforward. Again, this is no news to anybody who's seasoned on working on cars, but if you only deal with them from time to time, especially, you know how many front wheel bearings I've replaced? I think maybe in my lifetime I'm 50. As a weekender, maybe 2 or 3. And some of the cars didn't have ABS, of course, back in the day. In fact, none of them did. So yeah, I hope that helps somebody. I just want to point out one thing. Okay, I happened to come across this young fella, Matthias Ox, I think is, apologies if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. You can see how it's actually spelled there. Young German fella. All his videos are actually in German, but his technical capacity and artistic capacity is actually really interesting. I found his videos actually quite watchable, again, in spite of the fact that very, very few of them are actually even subtitled for English. This video in particular here, where he takes an Appy, a wee tiny transport vehicle, and actually converts it into a little off-road rig for his own purposes, is actually extremely interesting. So yeah, if you're interested, and that's somebody new I've actually been watching. Here's Dave. My thanks again to Dave for putting me onto this, because this is actually extremely useful in certain instances. Yeah, so check him out. Check out Dave there. So that's it. I've dragged this out too long. I'll leave it at that. Okay, that's it, boys. Cheers.